All right, we are learning our discourse about faith in God. We are on chapter 2. This week, we may not even get to the text because I felt at the end of last week that we're not really explaining well enough what's going on here. So, I was thinking about it, and I went over a lot of what we've learned, and I have basically decided to do this week at least a little bit more of a lecture style rather than a text-based learning, which is an exception to what I prefer to do. The lecture should be taken with much more of a grain of salt than what the text says, because the lecture is my own summary of what I've learned rather than the text itself. But I feel that it would be beneficial to us because I feel like we're maybe going a little too fast and we're not really. It's not really sinking in what we're saying. I'm not explaining it well enough. So, without further ado, our discourse is talking about the difference between this chapter in our discourse is talking about the difference between faith and knowledge, the difference between knowing something, what's called yodeya, it's called knowing something in the Holy Tongue, and what's called emunah, what's called faith. Our translations, as we're going to see, and this is sort of the point of the class, is that the two words, the whole problem with learning about this topic is that the two words come with a whole bundle of connotations in English that simply do not apply to our context. There's so many things that we're not talking about, that are not what the topic of the class is, and the reason why we're having a lot of confusion, I think, is because a lot of what we're not talking about, because of the words, and because the words seem to be related and the concepts seem to be related, is getting worked in sort of mentally. You know, someone says faith and someone thinks of a certain type of thing, which is not what we're talking about, and someone says rationality or knowledge, which is talking about a certain type of thing, that's also not what we're talking about. So we need to take a step back and figure out what it means in Chassidus. Faith and knowledge, or faith and reason, is maybe a different way of saying it, which is a dichotomy that's spoken about in many different contexts and in many different places. In our context, we're going to see it has a very specific, almost technical definition. What we're talking about, the difference between these two things. Okay. So we started out by explaining, coming from the previous chapter of the Maimer, we explained that the difference from Chassidus' perspective, and this is really based on Kabbalah, the Kabbalah says that the difference between knowledge and faith is that the godliness, which is called Mamale Kolamin, God as He invests Himself within the worlds, within our world and within all of the spiritual worlds, all the limited spiritual worlds, that can be known. We're going to explain what this means. And Sevev Kol Almin, that aspect of godliness which surrounds the worlds, which is not invested in the worlds, which remains divested from the worlds, separate from the worlds, God in His infinitude, God as He knows Himself, rather than He descends to be invested within the creation, that aspect of godliness is known known as a dangerous, because we're saying knowledge is one type of thing. It's already a problem. Can be, let's say, is apprehended through faith. So again, the godliness that's within the world, that God as He expresses Himself to create and invest Himself within the worlds, is what is known, is apprehended through knowledge. God as He remains separate from the world is apprehended or grasped through something called emunah, through faith. That's what we know coming into this chapter. We haven't explained what these two things are or why there are even two things, and we may have gone ahead without explaining it, which I think would have been a bad idea. So let's talk about that now. The first thing we're going to talk about is two things that faith is not. When we say faith, two easy things you could easily confuse what we mean when we're drawing the distinction between faith and reason. One thing that faith is not is it's not the leap of faith as it's known in our common culture, right? There's this perception that the way, let's say, a religious worldview explains the world and explains God's relationship with the world, is that there are certain things which can be known, there are certain questions that have answers. And once you run out of answers, right, it's an assumption, if you run out of answers. Once you run out of answers, faith is supposed to be what sort of picks up the load, right? You have reason which only goes so far, and then you have faith which covers for all the things that cannot be explained, or things that, so in other words, it's as if to say that the only thing which is keeping you, so to speak, committed to, let's call it roughly religion, or committed to a relationship with God, or however you want to look at it, is faith. Because if you don't have faith, if you don't have this ability to sort of push questions aside and just believe anyway, sort of contrary to reason, or more in a nicer way of saying it is beyond reason, but if you didn't have faith, if you didn't have an ability to supersede wisdom, then you wouldn't have any relationship with the religion or any relationship with God at all. So in other words, faith in that context is a description of basically, it's almost like a coping mechanism, a mechanism that a person uses to maintain their relationship with God, even if it's not going so well, they don't understand it, etc. This is not what we mean by faith in this context. That concept of faith is not really, I don't know about other Jewish contexts, but in Chassidus' understanding, that is not faith. It doesn't have much room. Let's put it that way. This idea that a person asks questions and then the idea from the get-go that if a person doesn't get answers, he wouldn't have a relationship with God or might forsake his religion. That question from the get-go is completely rejected by Chassidus. You don't begin to have a relationship with God because your questions are answered, and there's no room to stop having that relationship if your questions aren't answered. So this idea that you would need some sort of coping mechanism to replace your answers, to replace your understanding, is not even a concept that begins in Chassidus. Your relationship with God isn't founded on a rational understanding or having your questions answered. So why would we need a mechanism called faith to cover for when your questions are not answered? That's a total non sequitur here. That's not what we're talking about. That's not the faith we're talking about. Another thing we're not talking about when we say faith is the difference between learned and revealed knowledge, right? Not just in Judaism, but in any religion, what makes it a religion, right, is revelation. What makes a religion, rather than just a system of thought, is the idea that there is a truth, an eternal truth, revealed from above the world to someone. That's what makes it a religion, right? That there's some sort of teaching that you couldn't arrive to on your own, or that you wouldn't have arrived to on your own just by being in the world and looking at and observing the world. That sort of thing is more properly called philosophy. Then there is a point where the truth is revealed to you from above, and all of a sudden, truth being revealed to you from above means it's a religion. It means there's revelation. So there's learned knowledge that you can learn from the world, philosophical knowledge, and then there's revealed knowledge. There's what comes from above. There's revelation. And some might think that the distinction between faith and reason goes along this border, that reason is what you can learn from the world on your own, in other words, without God telling you anything. Faith is this idea that God comes and reveals some sort of truth to me. So, for example, we say that there's three different types of mitzvahs, right? There's three different types of commandments in the Torah. There's chukim, mishpatim, and ediyos. Chukim are the irrational laws, the laws for which there's no real logical basis for performing them. What that means exactly requires explanation, because all mitzvahs have, to some extent, an explanation. So what does it mean that certain mitzvahs are in the category of not having an explanation? That's a larger question. I'm just note that to some extent every commandment in the Torah has a rational aspect and an irrational aspect. But that's a whole. Put that aside for the moment. Putting that aside, there's some mitzvahs which don't have an explanation, right? Like, for example, to not wear shatnez, to not wear wool and linen together in your clothing is a classic chok. Why are we not supposed to wear wool and linen together in a piece of clothing? Because God said so. There's no explanation.
Meat and dairy.
Pardon?
Meat and dairy.
Meat and dairy, kosher is another example. Many examples. Then there's mishpatim, which are the logical laws of the Torah, which are defined. So the chukim, we say the technical definitions of these terms are the legal definitions. Chukim are the laws of the Torah that we would never have thought to do if we weren't told to do them, right? In other words, they're pure revelation, the chukim, like the laws of the Torah that we would never think not to wear wool and linen together unless God told us don't wear wool and linen together. Then there's mishpatim. Mishpatim are the laws that we would do even if the Torah had not been given to us. For example, don't kill and don't steal. We say in Judaism that even if the Torah had not been given, we would realize that these are necessary behaviors for the foundation of a just and stable society. The best society for everyone is a society where I'm not allowed to kill you and you're not allowed to kill me. I'm not allowed to steal from you, you're not allowed to steal from me. And these anyone could figure out. You don't need the Torah to figure this out necessarily. Then there's the idiyos, which are mitzvahs that once God has told us about them, they make sense. So, for example, like sukkahs, they're all basically commemorations of past events. So we sit in a sukkah to commemorate the miracle of God protecting us in the desert. So that makes sense once God tells us to do it. Before God tells us to commemorate that, we may not have thought to. Once He told us to commemorate it, now it makes sense. Those are the three categories. So you have between the chukim and the mishpatim, at least, you have a very clear example between the so to speak, the illogical dictates and the logical prescriptions of the Torah. We see here that within Judaism we have this idea that there's some things you can learn from the world on your own. And there's something, even in the mitzvahs of the Torah, not even speaking philosophically or theoretically, even in the actions of how a person's supposed to live, there's things you could learn from the world on your own, just through logic and being a thinking human being. And then there's things which you would never have come up with on your own. There are things which are irrational dictates of the Torah. And a person could think that here's the point of the whole discussion about the different types of mitzvahs. A person could think that to do mishpatim, all I need is rationality. To do the mitzvahs that make sense, all I need is my rational mind, right? Because they're the mitzvahs that make sense. But the mitzvahs that don't make sense to me, that is faith. I do those mitzvahs because of my faith, right? I keep kosher, I don't wear shatnez because I have faith. Right? That's one way you could maybe think to draw a distinction. You might think that the distinction between rationality and logic is what I can learn to do just from the world and what God reveals to me. Chassidus, again, rejects this notion of faith. This is not what we mean by faith. Chassidus and Kabbalah say that even those things, that there are even things which are purely revealed from God, that are pure revelation, that we can know, that are not faith, that fall under the category of logic, right? If you think back to what we said at the beginning and what we brought from the previous chapter of the Maimer, you bring the idea that Mamale Kolamin, God as He invests Himself within the world, is something that you can know, means that there are levels in spiritual worlds and there are spiritual realities that we would not know about unless they were revealed to us in the Kabbalah. And those realities fall under the category of knowledge. In other words, there's things that are revelation only that you can know. There are things that are revealed to you only that you don't relate to as faith, but you can actually know them. So to sum up, there's two things that are not the distinction between faith and knowledge. Number one, as we said before, the idea that faith is this sort of crutch that you use, or this coping mechanism that you use to remain attached to God, even though you don't have answers to your questions anymore. That's not what we mean by faith. And then there's a second thing that we don't mean by faith, which is this notion that revealed knowledge versus learned knowledge. That's also not what we mean by faith versus knowledge. So then the question becomes: so if those are not the distinction, so then what is the distinction? If there are things that if it's not important, whether or not I can answer my questions, if that's not the distinguishing factor, and learn knowledge from the world and versus revelation from God is also not the distinction. So then what's the distinction between faith and knowledge? And what do we even mean by these terms? Okay, so that's what it's not. Until now we've discussed what it's not. These are things that probably confuse the matter, so I'm glad that I think it's a good thing to talk about what it's not. So what then are faith and intellect? Faith and intellect, or faith and reason, are two different means to apprehending the truth. There are two different methods, or two different tools, or two different handles that you can use to grasp the truth. The question immediately, so let's leave it at that for the moment. There's two different ways of apprehending the truth. The immediate question is, why have two when you can have one? Right? In other words, in order to understand what the dichotomy is between faith and reason, or faith and knowledge, we have to understand why would it be, in other words, and we ask this in the full religious sense, in the sense that Chassidus would ask it, in other words, why would God create such a world where there are two different ways of apprehending the truth? If there is a truth, and there's a truth of God, and there's something that's constant, there's something to be known in this universe that's actually true, that's consistent, and that's necessary, and that always was and always will be, and there's something that we as human beings and we as Jews can apprehend in that way, why would there be two ways of doing it? What?
Freedom of choice.
What? Freedom of choice? Like Coke and Pepsi is freedom of choice?
Coke and Pepsi is not freedom of choice. Coke is freedom of choice.
Huh? So tefillin and tzitzis are freedom of choice, but tefillin and going to the nightclub is not freedom of choice. Well, I guess you wouldn't put tefillin on at night, so it's a false dichotomy. But anyway, the point is that the freedom of choice, I understand what you're saying, but the freedom of choice that you're talking about is usually understood as a freedom of choice between a good thing and a bad thing, right? You could either work to know the truth, or you can deceive yourself with lies, for example. This is not knowing the truth and deceiving yourself with lies. God created the world in such a way that there are two different ways that every person can know the truth. There is intellect and reason, and then there's faith. Well, the question is why. It seems more like a Coke and Pepsi choice rather than let's say, a Coke and cyanide choice, if that makes any sense, if you understand what I'm saying. It's a choice between two different, it seems to be a choice in degree or in quality. It's not a choice in choosing the right path versus the wrong path. It's not a moral choice. It's not a choice between the right thing and the wrong thing. It's a choice between two good things. And the question is, why would there be two of them? Why would God create the world in such a way that there's knowing and there's believing? There's knowing something through das, and there's knowing something through emunah. And the answer in Chassidus, and again, everything I'm saying is a summary of what I have learned, so it's worth a grain of salt or two. The answer according to Chassidus, very roughly, is like this. The world is created in two ways. The world, or rather, let's put it, the world, when it is created by the combination of two methods, or two forces, two modalities, if I was feeling very professorial. There's two different ways that God uses together in the creation of the world. And these are two things that we've spoken about already. There's Sevev Kol Almin and Mamale Kol Almin. There's God in his infinitude, God before he invests himself within the world, and there's God as he invests himself within the creation. And from these two expressions, or these two motive expressions of God, the world is created. How does that play out? The first thing, as we mentioned last week, is that there's a difference in the world between what are called philosophically form and matter, which is another way of saying what the thing is, versus that the thing is here. There's what the thing is, and there's that the thing is here. In the physical world, for example, there's the cup. The cup is created in the form of a cup. It explains in Tanya that when God creates the world, he rearranges the letters, whatever that means. God speaks the letters, kos, in the holy tongue, chaf, vav, samach, which means cup. And from those combinations of letters, which we have to understand is obviously not a physical thing. We're speaking of a very deep metaphorical process, which you can learn about more in Tanya. But when God, to some extent metaphorical, becomes the question in Chassidus, as we've spoken about before, of what's real and what's the metaphor, right? But that's a different discussion. So God speaks the word kos, he speaks the word cup, and from the combination of that letters, there becomes a nature of something, the nature of something that is a cup, that exists to hold liquid, let's say. That's what a cup is. That's the essence of being a cup. And when God speaks those letters and he desires to create the cup, that's what he's creating. He's creating what's called the essence of a cup, or the nature of a cup. That is a spiritual creation. The letters of Kos is a spiritual creation, right? In other words, by God, there is something, God possesses or has something in the spiritual realms called a cup. There's some spiritual reality called a cup. And that's the truth of what it means to be a cup. That spiritual reality comes down through what's called Seder Ishtalshelus, the order of the worlds. And all that really means for our context is that that notion becomes more and more coarse until it can be applied even to something as limited and non-eternal and untrue as a single physical cup. So again, there is the form of the cup. There's what it means for something to be a cup. And God creates that. He brings that into being by speaking, like it says in the book of Bereshis, and that actually is what creates the cup. Except there's one thing that cannot do, or there's the limited expression in that way. The limited expression in that way is that it cannot actually produce a physical reality in the physical world. Right? How can a spiritual being or a spiritual essence, the essence of what it means to be a cup, produce an actual physical cup? There's a gap there. It's shaloi be'erech. It's incommensurate. There's a breach in the process that cannot be passed. The example they used to say in yeshiva is that there's no idea, right? Like if you have a great sage or a great professor, and he understands a very, very deep idea, and he's trying to teach the idea to a very young and coarse and sort of thick-headed student. So they have to bring the idea down. They have to take the idea from where it is naturally, and they have to bring it down so through examples and through metaphors, etc., that it fits into a very, very simple and unrefined mind. What a teacher cannot do is bring the idea of a concept so low that a physical object actually is created from the idea. That doesn't make sense. An idea can be brought down lower, it can be made more coarse, but it's ultimately a spiritual being. You can't create the physical from the spiritual. In fact, the words are a contradiction in terms. Spiritual and physical represent two fundamental opposites. It's two things that never meet. They simply exist in different planes. You're talking about something else. Clearly, when you're talking about the table and you're talking about the Pythagorean theorem, you're talking about two different types of things that cannot interact. Things that cannot interact in their natural form. The Pythagorean theorem is never going to bump into this table. That's just not how it works. Right? They're spiritual and physical, and they're in two completely different worlds. So, to breach the gap, and it's a true gap, you need, according to Chassidus, you need an infinite power to cross the unbreachable gap. The unbreachable gap, to make something into its opposite, or to do what's called in Torah, yesh ma'ayin, create something from nothing, you need an infinite power. You need something that is not bound by the system that says these two things are opposites. And therefore, you need also to bring an infinite expression. It's the infinite expression which lends the cup a physical existence. The cup is made a cup spiritually. There's something called a spiritual cup. And that's where the form of the cup comes from. But the actual matter of the cup, that it should be a physical thing, is created by God's infinite power. Okay, so 1 second. Let me connect this back to what we were speaking about before. The world is created in two ways. Everything has two aspects to it. What could very roughly be called its body and its soul. Souls derive from the spiritual world. They exist on a spectrum with everything that's spiritual, everything that's not physical. There's some that are more refined and higher. There's some which are coarser and which are lower, but they exist in a commensurate spectrum. You could move up and down in that world. But the body, the physical manifestation, is a break from all of that. And that comes from God's infinite power. So God in his limited, God, when God creates anything, from this cup to an angel and everything in between, he creates it using two modes, two ways of expression. He expresses himself in a finite way to create the form, the spiritual form of the thing. And he expresses himself in an infinite way. It's only his infinite expression which can create the body of the thing. Okay? This all sounds very technical. I'm going to make it less technical.
I have a question.
Sure.
He or.
Pardon?
He or.
Yeah.
That's the combination of both of those together?
We say just or. Vayihi means, I don't know, it's a good question. I never really thought about Vayihi.
No, but it's like, let it be. It's like,
No, you're saying the combination of the letters. I don't know.
When basically God created light with both the manifestation of the spiritual light as well as the physical light.
Are there any other are there any other questions?
yeah, I wanted to have something like, you're talking about the combination of the letters, like you look at the word kerach, kuf, reish,
Yeah.
and then you call charak.
Yeah.
Actually the same letters, but completely different.
Different order. The order matters.
There is some connection, but the order matters.
Okay. Why is all this important? I understand this is all very abstract. We're going to try and make it less abstract, all right? Let's say all of this in a different way, in a much more concrete and a simple way. To create something from something happens in our world all the time, right? You take an ice cube and it melts into a puddle of water. Something can become something. Something from nothing does not exist in our world at all. There is no such thing in our world and in our knowledge as creating something from nothing. In fact, we have a word for when something appears to appear from nothing. It's called magic, and we don't believe it, right? We think it's very odd. It doesn't sit well by us. So when a magician pulls the rabbit out of the hat, your question is not, oh my gosh, how did you perform this miracle? The question is, where did you get that rabbit? And for good reason, because in our world, there's no such thing as something from nothing. There's no such thing as something appearing from nowhere. Everything in our world has a direct cause, is something that caused it. The idea of something from nothing, on the other hand, is totally unknown to us. Now, it's not just that it's technically unknown to us. It's that the truth is that creating something from nothing is unknowable. Creating something from nothing is not something that we can understand. In fact, with everything that's explained in Chassidus and all the things we know from Kabbalah and Torah and all the deep explanations of everything that God does, how something is created from nothing has no explanation and cannot have an explanation. If you think about it for a moment, it doesn't make sense that something from nothing should have an explanation, right? For literally nothing to become something, is the definition of an impossibility. It's the definition of something that cannot happen. The fact that it happens is not just it doesn't just go beyond our understanding, it seems to go beyond what is possible, but in our conception. The idea that something should come from nothing is beyond the grasp of intellect, in other words. Now you may start to begin to see a connection. To create something from nothing, to create the actual matter of the cup, is something that is beyond our understanding and beyond our explanation. There is no explanation for where the matter came from, right? Assuming that the universe did not exist forever. Let's assume for a moment, right? That's a famous philosophical debate. But we know from Torah that the universe was created. Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz. God created the world. And we know that He created the world from nothing. So when God creates the world from nothing, the process that is taking place is He is lending a already existing and eternal, so to speak, a relatively eternal spiritual form to something, to physical matter that He is creating in a way of a miracle. He's creating physical matter in a way that is totally inexplicable, totally not graspable by the rational mind, that something should arise from nothing. Something just pops into existence. The whole idea, as soon as you say something pops into existence, you're already thinking about magic tricks. It doesn't even, it veers away from, the rational mind recoils even from the idea that something can just become. Become from what? From where? That's our immediate question. And the answer is from nowhere. It just became. What do you mean it just became? It just became. But made out of what? What's it made out of? What's the stuff that became, the polystyrene is ultimately made out of what? If the entire world is created from nothing. What's it made out of? I have no idea. It's a weird concept. What's it made out of? I don't know. Where did it come from? It has no root in anything. It just wasn't there and then it was.
Well, that's because we didn't see infinity. It's like we don't understand infinity.
That's what I'm saying. Not just we didn't see it, we can't understand it.
We can't. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So,
Beyond rationality.
God creates the world in two ways. He creates the world there's part of the creation of the world that we can grasp. There's part of the creation of the world that we can understand. And there's part of the creation of the world, that we cannot understand. There's part of the creation of the world that's like something from nothing. So we return to so we're beginning to grasp now the difference between faith and knowledge. That faith and knowledge there's two different ways to apprehend the truth, as we said a while ago. Because there are two different types of things in the world, or there's two different, that God created the world using two different modes of expression. And each of those can be apprehended by a different faculty that we have, by a different tool that we can use as human beings and as Jews.
Just to clarify.
Yeah.
There's a difference between apprehending and comprehending.
Well, I don't want to use comprehending because I don't want to get mixed up between the whole, so let's say grasping, something like that. I just want to mean...
You mean apprehend as in grasp.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, that's what I mean by apprehend. I don't mean apprehend in the intellectual sense. I'm trying to just avoid all the intellectual words. Because what does it mean to have faith on something that you intellectually comprehend? That's what I'm not trying to say. So let's say grasp. There's the reason why there are two tools that we have to grasp the truth of something, to grasp at the truth, is because the truth comes in two parts. The truth is created in two ways. The truth is created in one system that's logical and understandable, and it's created with a different system that's something from nothing, that's inexplicable, for that the mind cannot grasp. So the mind, knowing something, knowledge, is what God gave us to grasp the truth of the form of the thing, the way that the thing makes sense. And faith is what God gave us to grasp the inexplicable aspect of the thing, the part of the thing that doesn't make sense. Okay? When referring to godliness, it fits beautifully, because the things in the world that don't make sense, that cannot make sense, that are beyond the realm of logic, come from those levels of godliness which are not invested within the creation. And the things which do make sense, the forms, the things that we can understand, come from what God invests within the creation. So you have mamale kol almin, God as He fills the world. And you have forms and things that make sense on the one hand. And you have sevev kol almin, and matter and the inexplicable and the illogical on the other side. But we still have our question. We still have the original question. The original question is, why would God create two instead of one? Right? God could create the whole world something from nothing if He wanted to, or vice versa. If God really wanted to, He could create the world in such a way that it all made sense. It all derived from these forms that we can grasp, and from these limited expressions of godliness. So the question still remains: why both? Why do you need faith and knowledge? So we answered the question why you need both faith and knowledge, because faith and knowledge, each one is for a different aspect of the world, a different aspect of the truth. The question becomes, why are there two aspects of the truth in the first place? God can do anything, according to Chassidus at least. God can do anything. God can create anything in His world.
Is it for God or for man?
Pardon?
Is it for God or for man? Because God could create anything, so it's really for man to be able to reach.
Very good. Very insightful. God, when He creates the world, why does God create the world, according to Chassidus? God creates the world, according to Chassidus, which is really not just Chassidus, it's what it says in the Medrash. Chassidus emphasizes this Medrash. Chassidus says that God creates the world because He wants a place to dwell. He wants to dwell in the lowest possible place. In other words, God creates a place that is totally antithetical to Him, and He wants to be revealed within that place. And it turns out that part of what it means to be revealed in a place that's antithetical to you is to grant free choice to sentient creatures that can decide for themselves. That's the ultimate way of locking yourself out, of God locking Himself out of the world, is to actually give the world over to the choice of the beings that are within the world. right? It's a whole long explanation, but if you really get to the bottom of what this medrash means, that God wants to dwell in the lowest place, it means he creates a world like ours, where he's completely concealed for the world, and to the extent that people have a choice between whether even to believe that there is a God over the world, or whether the world is given over to chaos. And the whole goal is that the beings with free choice, and the human beings, and particularly the Jews with their special chosen mission, should be able to bring him back into the world.
What sort of implies that God has a need for completion?
It's a very, very complicated, it's a very good question, and the answer is very complicated and not for now, but Chassidus talks about this question. It's a good question. It's a very good question. Whether this means that God needs, it's a very good question. Whether this means God needs to create the world for the purposes of completion. The short answer is that if God wanted to really be complete, the very short answer, and the answer is not going to help anything, but I'll say it anyway. The short answer is that if God really wanted to be complete, he wouldn't create a world as low as ours. He would create something higher and more spiritual and more perfect. That's the bottom line. If the world were to express a completion of it.
God is complete. It comes from nit'ava.
There's sources in the Torah which says that God created the world in order that he should be known. There's some that say God created the world in order that his powers should be expressed. There's all sorts of things. They're for various reasons, and it's explained at length in Chassidus. The explanation that fits best the world of ours, such as it is, in Chassidus's esteemed opinion, and the opinion of the Rebbeim, is the explanation that God wanted a world in which he would be to be revealed in the lowest place, to have a home in the lowest, a dwelling place in the lowest world. But that's still very theoretical. Really, God creates. So why does God create the world in two ways? God creates the world in two ways because this really gets at the core of what the difference between what it means to, because we haven't really explained the difference between what it means to know and what it means to have faith. We've really just explained that there are two different faculties for grasping, for apprehending two different things. But that doesn't imply they're different at all. Maybe they're just the same thing, but we use them to grasp different aspects of reality. But really that's not true. Really they're fundamentally different. Knowing something and believing and grasping it through faith are two completely different things. And the answer to this question really explains how. It explains how they're two completely different things.
There could be a balance between a trade-off, in a sense, between faith and knowledge. It could be a perfect, harmonious.
Absolutely, that's
almost like an economics, but a rate of substitution.
Sure. That's to some extent. I think that's the goal, and the explanation is and why is that the goal? Because
The implication of that is, gain faith, you have to give up knowledge at a certain level.
well, knowledge doesn't grasp anything beyond a certain level, and the question is why. And the answer is like this: it goes back to the two different ways God creates the world. We said again, God creates the world. There's part of the world that makes sense, that is based on spiritual realities, and there's part of it which is created only from His infinite expression. I'll ask a question with an obvious answer. If God expresses himself infinitely, what room is there for a relationship with God? And the answer is not only is there no room for a relationship with God, there's no room for anything else to exist at all. If God purely expresses himself in a way of we'll explain it in human relationships in a minute, what the metaphor would be. But let me explain it to you like this. Fundamentally, because of the nature of these two different ways that the world is created, one where God expresses himself infinitely, and one where he limits himself to logical and defined and understandable, to limited forms. That's what we mean when we say he invests himself within the world. He expresses himself in a limited capacity. Because of the difference between an infinite expression and a limited expression, there is a fundamental difference between knowing something and believing it. Because there's a difference in his limited expression and his infinite expression, there's a fundamental difference in what it means to know something and to believe something. Knowledge is a relationship. Knowledge is a shared participation in one reality. Knowledge is a shared participation in one reality. The most obvious and the easiest and most related example of this is that if you can prove that God exists, that means you can prove it to someone else. This is what it's funny, the magic comes back into it, but I once saw a video in which Penn Jillette, who's one of the famous Las Vegas magician, he says that a proof is just another form of love. Proof of something is another form of love. What does he mean by that? He means that if you can prove something, if you can demonstrate something intellectually, what does that say about the thing fundamentally? It means that it's a reality that's shareable. We have a shareable reality. I know about something, it's part of my world. I can teach you about it, you can learn it, and it becomes our world. We share the thing together. Knowledge is 1 + 1 = 3. There's you come from your place, I come from my place, and we have a shared third thing called our relationship that exists between us. This is the nature of knowledge. And the reason why that's the nature of knowledge is because God limited himself in the creation of the world. The aspect of the world that is created from God limiting himself is the aspect of the world that is relational. It's God saying, there is one thing which is a reality that I am participating in. There's something called Chesed of Atzilus. There's a spiritual level. That is real to me. That's real in my conception. God says, this is a limited reality that I am choosing to create. The limited reality that he chooses to create, he wants us to be able to participate in that as well. And that participation is called knowing. That participation in the limited reality is called knowing. And really, that's a relationship. That's a relationship with God. Part of God wanting to dwell within the lowest place is wanting a relationship with the creation. Not just to dictate something to the creation, not just for him to overwhelm the creation, but that we should have an equal participation in this third thing which binds us together, called love, called a relationship, and called knowledge. And these things are all related. Knowledge is subjugating oneself to a shared reality. I subjugate my free self. I don't have to know anything. I don't have to acknowledge anything. There are people in the world who think the earth is flat. Still, even though it's a myth that in the Middle Ages they thought that was true. But there's people nowadays who sort of like, conspiracy theorists who think that the earth is flat. They flat out refuse. They flat out, that was unintentional. They flat out refuse to participate in our shared reality that the world is round. They choose a different reality. They choose a different shared conception of the world. I understand this raises a question about subjective and objective. That's a whole other thing. It's a question, if you really believe in God, what's objective anyway? So whatever. So let's say that God's opinion on things is more important than people's opinions on things with regards to subjective and objective. But in any case, knowledge is that shared relationship. It's love, it's dwelling in one place. So when God creates the world, he could create it something from nothing, everything, but he decides to create it in a way that's understandable, at least partially, which means that the beings in this low world are going to have the opportunity not just to receive from God, not just to have a received reality when God tells them what's real, but that they can participate in the reality with God. They can be equal partners to an extent in their reality. For that to happen, God has to limit himself, make something that's objectively and systematically true, and then we participate in that reality by knowing it. That's knowledge. And it all derives from the idea that God wants to dwell with us. That's basically the bottom line. The reason why we can understand something, the reason why God creates the world in a way that some things are understandable is because he wants to dwell with us. Part of his desire to be within the lowest world is a desire to have a shared reality, to have something in common with us. And that's why he doesn't just create everything, something from nothing. He limits himself to the spiritual forms so that spiritual reality can be the place where we can meet God, where we can have a shared reality and a shared relationship with the Creator. That's why Kabbalah was exciting and is exciting. That's the whole idea fundamentally underlying the Kabbalah. It's not some sort of Gnostic pursuit where you're like a alchemist. Will have some sort of you're working with sulfur in your dark closet and you have pentagrams on the walls. That's not Kabbalah. The whole purpose of the Kabbalah, the whole purpose that there are spiritual realities that fundamentally underlying the world there are forms and things that make sense. There's such a thing as kindness and there's such a thing as severity, and you can actually, if you learn about it, you can see how they relate to create different things in the world, different dialectical realities and things like that. Participating in that way of seeing the world, participating in knowing those forms, is sharing a reality with God who chose to create the world that way, even though he didn't have to.
It's almost like in statistics, there are degrees of freedom. When you have a sample size, and let's say 100 population, there's so many degrees of freedom. You don't get the average of this standard deviation or something like that. You don't use the entire sample. You deduct, because if you know 99, you know the 100.
Right.
And I'm not sure if the 100th is God or
Right.
the 99 is God, but all together is the population.
Right. I think I hear what you're saying. It's ultimately we're saying both. At least in terms of God's creating the world, at least in terms of godliness. Remember, we did distinguish between God and godliness, but that's a discussion for a different. I don't want to confuse things more at the moment. So, in other words, by the way, this understanding has massive impact on what it means to really say, what it means to believe in monotheism, to believe that there's one God who actually creates the world. Because really what we're saying, this is like a parenthetical, really what we're saying is that God is not grasped by intellect in any way. God himself is not grasped by intellect in any way. It's backwards to think so, right? The way Hasidus understands the world is that intellect is a creation of God, created for a specific purpose. In fact, that anything should be intelligible, that anything should be understandable, is a choice of God for a very specific end, right? This means that ultimately the grand pursuit of understanding everything, the idea that somehow you're going to learn enough and you're going to understand the Creator, you're going to be able to predict exactly what's going to happen. You're going to be free of any concern or doubt or anything like that. The whole idea is ludicrous from the start, right? When you realize that the world was only partially created to be intelligible, and the intelligence itself, our ability to understand things, was created for a very specific end. It was created for the end of understanding the Creator and having that shared reality with Him. That's what He wants us to do with our intellect. So the idea that God Himself obeys the laws of intellect in Chassidus' eyes, is a very backwards way of thinking. That's going about the whole problem backwards. That's saying that a priori what's real is that everything makes sense and everything exists within the bounds of logic, and my mind and what makes sense dictates what's possible. And God himself follows those dictates. That's the way of philosophy. Chassidus is not the way of philosophy. Chassidus says that intellect and the laws of logic and all of these things are itself things that God created for a specific purpose, with a specific range.
It's almost like if God created creatures that knew God intrinsically, then they wouldn't know God.
Why not?
Because in order to know, it's like saying, well, I'm not you, you're not me. But if we were the same, we wouldn't know that, right? You have to have something, you have to have some division in order to recognize that something else exists.
Absolutely. That's one of the reasons why we say that God doesn't suffice with the creation of the angels. Because in Chassidus' eyes, that's basically what an angel is. An angel is a being that is created to know God. It is created with an innate knowledge of God. It knows God, and an angel is so caught up in its own knowledge of God that it can't even be separate enough to do what God desires necessarily, to some extent, at least not in the way that a person can. It's very interesting. It's a robot or an animal.
Yeah, but God actually revealed himself, not himself, but he was revealed to Adam and Eve.
Sure. He was revealed on Mount Sinai as well.
So they knew of his existence.
Yeah, sure. It's a different type of knowledge. Remember, the fact that God exists is not something that we say is a matter for faith. We say this is a matter for knowledge.
Why does God seek to have man know him?
1 second. So there's I just want to repeat the point I said before. The knowledge that God, the fact that God exists in Chassidus's understanding and in really the fundamental religious understanding is not something that it's not a faith thing, it's a knowledge thing. In other words, the fact of God's existence is one of the things that he puts in the world with the method of limiting himself, the method of being able to be known. Or a different way of saying it is that the God of philosophy is something rather like God as he contracts himself to express himself in what Chassidus calls Mamad Kalaman. This is in fact something that it says in a footnote, if anyone understands what I'm saying. This is actually something it says in the footnote in Tanya, that the Rambam's understanding of what God is very similar to what Chassidus would say is the way God expresses himself in the world of Atzilus. Is a sort of a limited expression of God. But that God can be known according to Chassidus, not for Emunah, because it's within Mamale Kolam. It's God of Mamale Kolam, and it's God as he expresses himself in the world, right? It fits beautifully. God as he expresses himself in a way that he can be known from the world is not God himself. It's the God as he expresses himself in Mamale Kolam. Right, as he expresses himself, as he limits himself to be within the world. Why would God limit himself and have an expression of himself that can be known from the world? Because again, he wants to have this shared reality with us. That reality is a shared reality. In other words, God, as he limits himself to be within the world, is a God that you can share with someone else with proof. You can share with someone else with love. This is a shared reality. This is something we can all know. As an aside, I thought about this when I was doing the notes. I have no idea whether this is true. This is completely my own idea. But this also is an explanation as to why belief in God is one of the 7 mitzvahs for the non-Jews. One of the 7 commandments of the non-Jews is a belief in God. And we say that the 7 mitzvahs for the non-Jew are not really commandments in the sense of irrational prescriptions from God, but rather they're 7 rules for making basically a just civilization. Which means they don't really have there's no real spiritual component there. It's something that anyone can know. It's something that non-Jews, that anyone needs to have a true and just civilization, which is a sign that faith in God, at least in the understanding of the mitzvahs for the non-Jews, has something to do with mamale kolam. It has to do with the things that can be known, the things that can be shared. We're not asking them to have a faith, to have a connection to God beyond rationality. We're asking them to have the connection within the bounds of what's rational. Maybe. I don't know. That's an idea I have. But anyway, last thing I want to say, we have 5 minutes left. One more thing. Why not create the world only in a way that we can understand it then? We explained why he doesn't create the whole world just something from nothing in a way that no one can understand, because then you don't have this shared reality. You don't have this shared reality with the beings who choose to know God. You don't have this shared reality that we say is knowledge. This mutual participation. You don't have this reality that God and the human beings can participate in. So why doesn't God create the world only in a way that's understandable? Why is there still a breach? Why have faith then? And the answer is because God doesn't just want to be known at the level of what we can participate in. God doesn't want to just have the shared reality is a limitation on him. Remember, he has to make himself non-infinite. He has to make himself small. He has to limit himself to certain confines for us to be able to share a reality with him. And he doesn't want to be known in the lower worlds only within those confines. He wants to be known in the lower worlds as he is, in all of his glory and his true infinitude. And if that's the case, then you need something else. You can't come down in that way, in a way of knowledge. If you want to be known, if you want to be grasped in the world, if God wants to express himself within the world, as he truly is, not as he confines himself and makes room for a relationship, but God as he truly is in all of his glory, as he exists even beyond the worlds. If he wants that to be known in the worlds, knowledge is not how it would be known. It would be known in a way of faith, and that's why he creates the world also in a way of infinitude, in a way of that he's not known. So in that way, in a way that can't be known intellectually, that can't be apprehended in that way, because he wants to be within the world, not just in a way of in the relationship that we both participate in. He wants to be in the world as his true self, as his infinite self. What's a good example of this? I was trying to think of there's quite a few actually metaphors for this in Chassidus. I thought of just a nice little one that we can say at the end here, very briefly. We see both of these things in Torah, in the way that the Torah is given. We know the Torah is wisdom from God. The Torah, and we also know that the world is created from Torah. The Torah is the blueprint of the world. So if everything in the world, including these two modalities, has its source in Torah, how do we see this? There's a fundamental distinction between the written Torah and the oral Torah. The written Torah is like faith. The oral Torah, the written Torah is apprehended by faith. The oral is grasped by faith. The oral Torah is grasped by the intellect. Right? What does that mean? That means that the written Torah is the actual scroll that sits in the Aron Kodesh. You're not allowed to change any letters. It's transmitted exactly the same, generation to generation. And you don't even need to understand what it says to fulfill the mitzvah of learning Torah. You can just read the words from the Sefer Torah and you fulfill the mitzvah of learning without even needing to understand. Why is that? Because there's an aspect of the Torah that is non-participatory. There's an aspect of the Torah where God says, this is me as I am, this is what I think as it is, take it or leave it. And when he says take it or leave it, he means every single letter. If you leave out one letter, it's no good. Because this isn't based on understanding. It's not like you can leave out one letter, but you can still understand what the word says, so it's okay. This is who I am, and it's in my complete expression. You're not allowed to change a single letter. It's not for understanding. It's not for your participation. You receive this. You're not involved. You're not participating. But if you have this, if you grasp this, you've grasped something that's mine. God is known in the world in his infinite expression. God is known in the world, in the written Torah, not for our participation, not for our understanding. It's not seeking to have a relationship with us. It's simply him expressing himself within the world as he is. And you can see by the limits on our ability to participate and to edit and to change the written Torah that this is an aspect of God's expression as he is. It's like an emunah expression, and your connection to it is not intellectual. You can learn, just reading its words is considered learning Torah. You don't even have to understand it. The connection is emunah. These words are things that came from God. That's the whole thing.
Yeah, but then why tell stories? Why have the whole lineage?
Then there's an oral Torah. Then there's...
But I mean, in the Torah, the written Torah...
Oh, why is it told in a way of story? Sure it is, because there's an understanding aspect as well. That's the bottom line. Because there's an understanding aspect as well. And we're going to go back over why we need both in a second. But first, let's understand the understanding aspect. Then there's an oral Torah. There's what the words mean. There's the stories it tells. There's the Talmud. There's the laws. There's the Mishnah. There's all the things that were passed along outside of the written Torah. And the oral Torah is the part of the Torah. It's to different extent, different parts of the oral Torah to different extents, but it's the part of the Torah that's given over to human participation. God says, I'm just going to give you the general principles and the general rules, and now you go crazy. You figure it out. You can learn something new in Torah today that's just as much the Torah as what's written in the scroll or what's written in the Talmud. As long as you use the right means of learning it out, the right means to come to a new conclusion, that too is Torah. There's an aspect of Torah which is participatory. God says, I'm hands off. You figure out what this means. Whatever the Beis Din says, whatever the Jewish court says in the case, that's what God desires. It's the court decides. It's not for me to decide, God says. I want you to participate in. This aspect of Torah, the knowing and the understanding aspect of Torah, is the part where we have a shared relationship. It's God's given Torah, but we participate in it. And in that way, we have a shared reality. We have a reality that we own together. We have something that we have a relationship with God. The Torah is love. We can make it a beautiful bumper sticker. So why do you need both? Why do you need both? It's from the Torah metaphor. I think it's very clear, and this really explains why you need faith and knowledge as well, right? You need both. On the one hand, if it were given over entirely to human understanding, it's not sacred. It loses its, this is a book that was given to us by God. How dare you touch it? How dare you think you participate in it, right? You lose that aspect of God as the infinite creator who's beyond the world and beyond our grasp. We can participate. We can have questions. We ask this way, we ask that way. It's like, who are you? This came from God. This is a holy thing, right? If it were only an oral law and only open to understanding, that's what would be the eventual understanding. If it were only a written law, on the other hand, we're totally shut out of it. The reality doesn't penetrate us. We don't have this one shared reality with God. God has his reality and he just gave it to us in a book, and you're not allowed to change a letter. You're not allowed to participate. You're not allowed to know. It's not a knowledge thing. It's a faith thing. And just the faith thing doesn't become one with us, which is really what we're going to learn next week when we continue in this chapter. That's what it talks about, how faith is external to the person. It doesn't change the person. Faith is something you participate in without it becoming a part of you, because it's not this real relationship. It's 100% God and 0% us. All we have to do is receive it. All we do is accept it. That doesn't change a person. That's not a real relationship. That's not the shared realm. And therefore, you need both. That's why there's a written Torah and an oral Torah. And this is really the metaphor and a good way to understand how, in understanding God, there's faith and there's knowledge. So in summary, let me just read. I wrote a little summary thing. Knowledge and faith are two means of grasping the truth. Neither is fundamental. Each is a creation with a certain purpose, and it's to grasp an aspect of the creation that God chose to create in two ways. The purpose of knowledge is to grasp those aspects of the creation where God limited himself so that we can have a shared reality in a shared space. And faith is to grasp those aspects where he infinitely expresses himself, and in order that his full expression should be within the world. And that's the summary.
Oh, it was very good what you did today. We needed that. We needed that.
Yeah. Even though it all summarized in one sentence, God made it that way because this is the way he wanted it to be. Simple as it is. Because his wish.
Take it or leave it.
Yeah.